in the middle of the Arctic Ocean, the Americans found something they desperately wanted: a Soviet military station. But there was one problem. The station was abandoned. There was no road, no runway, no ship that could reach IT, and the ice beneath it was constantly moving. So the United States came up with a plan that sounded almost impossible. 2 men would parachute onto the frozen Arctic, enter the abandoned Soviet station, collect whatever intelligence the Soviets had left behind, and then escape without an aircraft ever landing. This was Operation Cold Feet. And the way they got out was even more extraordinary than the way they got in. In the early 1960s, the United States was trying to understand how the Soviet Union was operating in the Arctic. The region was strategically important. Soviet submarines could use the Arctic as a route toward North America, and American intelligence wanted to know what the Soviets were doing there. Then American intelligence learned about an abandoned Soviet Arctic installation. The Soviets had left the site behind, but they had not necessarily taken everything with them. For American intelligence officers, that created an opportunity. Instead of trying to spy on the station from a distance, they could go inside. The goal was simple: get onto the station, search it, take the most valuable documents and equipment, then get out. The problem was getting there, and getting BACK. The station was sitting in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. There was no conventional way to land an aircraft directly beside IT. The ice was unstable. A normal rescue operation could be extremely dangerous. So the Americans chose 2 men for the mission. They were James Smith and Leonard Leshak. Their job was to parachute onto the ice, reach the abandoned Soviet station, and collect intelligence. They knew they would have limited time. The Arctic environment gave them almost no room for mistakes. If something went wrong, there would be nowhere nearby to simply walk to. The mission began with the 2 men being dropped onto the Arctic ice. They landed near the abandoned Soviet station, and now they had to work quickly. They entered the facility and began searching through what the Soviets had left behind. They weren't looking for souvenirs. They were looking for intelligence, documents, technical information, equipment, anything that could reveal what the Soviet military had been doing in the Arctic. And they found plenty. Over the course of the operation, the team gathered roughly 150 pounds of Soviet documents and equipment. But collecting the intelligence was only half the mission. They still had to leave, and that was the hardest part. Their aircraft could not simply land beside them. So the Americans used one of the strangest extraction systems ever developed for covert operations. It was called the Fulton Skyhook. The basic idea was simple. The aircraft would fly overhead. A person on the ground would attach themselves to a special line. A balloon would lift the line into the air. Then a specially designed system mounted on the aircraft would catch it. The aircraft would then pull the person off the ground and into the AI. R. No runway. Y. No landing. G. No helicopter. R. Just a person being pulled from the Arctic ice into a moving aircraft. But knowing the system worked in theory was one thing. Using it in the Arctic was another. The first attempt did not go perfectly. The team had to deal with the brutal conditions and the difficulty of operating the Skyhook system on the ice. The extraction required precision. The aircraft had to approach at the right angle. The line had to rise correctly, and the capture system had to grab it. A mistake could leave the men stranded on the ice. Eventually, the system worked. The aircraft caught the line, and the men were pulled away from the Soviet station. The operation was over. They had reached an abandoned Soviet Arctic installation, searched it, removed intelligence, and escaped without the aircraft ever landing. But the real value of Operation Cold Feet wasn't the dramatic extraction. It was what the Americans brought home. The documents and equipment collected from the Soviet station gave U.S. intelligence a rare opportunity to examine Soviet Arctic operations directly, instead of relying only on photographs, intercepted communications, or reports from agents. American analysts now had physical material taken directly from a Soviet facility. That made the mission valuable. The Arctic was becoming increasingly important to Cold War military planning. The United States needed to understand Soviet capabilities in the region, and Operation Cold Feet gave American intelligence another piece of that puzzle. what makes the operation remarkable is how little room there was for error. The mission depended on several things working together. The team had to reach the abandoned station. They had to find useful intelligence. They had to transport that intelligence back to the extraction point. And then they had to trust a system that required an aircraft to capture them from the ground. There was no conventional rescue waiting nearby. If the extraction failed, the Arctic itself became the enemy. Extreme cold, moving ice, distance, and isolation. Yet the mission succeeded. Operation Cold Feet eventually became one of the lesser-known intelligence operations of the Cold War. It never became as famous as major CIA operations involving Cuba or the Soviet Union. There were no armies fighting. No missiles were launched. No battle appeared on television. Instead, two men quietly entered an abandoned Soviet installation in the Arctic and came back with intelligence. But the mission demonstrated something important. During the Cold War, intelligence operations didn't always happen inside government buildings or behind enemy lines. Sometimes they happened hundreds of miles from civilization, on drifting ice, inside abandoned stations, with no road home. And sometimes, the most difficult part of a secret mission wasn't getting in. It was getting out. For Operation Cold Feet, the United States solved that problem with one of the strangest extraction methods ever used in the Arctic, a flying hook. That was Operation Cold Feet.